Situation: the Third Reich is making a desperate last stand in Berlin. Mission: enter the German capital, crush Nazi resistance. Execution: employ overpowering force in an assault on a well-fortified city. Administration: under orders from Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin. Command and control: Marshal WWII Zhukov. Welcome to Conquerors. I'm Captain Dale Dye. Take a look at this. It's a Soviet 107mm artillery round. Now here in the Conqueror's armory, it's relatively harmless. Fired on the battlefield, a round like this could blow a hole in the ground 20 feet in diameter and obliterate anybody who's in that area. When he fought the Battle of Berlin in 1945, Soviet Marshal WWII Zhukov had 7 million of these rounds ready to dump on the Germans. It was overwhelming firepower like that that made Zhukov a winner, the man who conquered Berlin. The battle began in the spring of 1945. The Red Army was aimed squarely at Berlin. It was the Glory Prize, and Zhukov was assigned to take it. He was the best senior field commander the Soviets had. His orders came down directly from Joe Stalin. The mission was this: take Berlin and put a red flag on the Reichstag by 1 May. But this was already the 1st of April, and everything was rushed. The Soviets were thinking the Western Allies might get there first, and Stalin had it fixed so Zhukov even had to race one of his own comrades to the city. The battle didn't start in the city itself. It began 40 miles due east of Berlin on the banks of the Oder River on 16 April 1945, 0300 hours, when Zhukov gave the order for a massive artillery barrage against German defensive lines just a few miles ahead.
(16,934 artillery pieces opened fire, supported by another 1,500 Katyusha rocket launchers. And they fired 1.2 million shells in 30 minutes.
His orders were that every gun should fire, whether it was aimed or not, to add to the cataclysmic din that would emerge from this.
It was the climax of World War II, in which Zhukov had accumulated a string of successes second to none.
Yes, soldiers spoke about Zhukov. They used to say, look, Zhukov is here. Victory is where Zhukov is.
This extraordinary leader came up through the ranks from the humblest of beginnings. He was born to a desperately poor family in 1896 and was drafted into the Tsar's army in World War I. He joined the Red Army during the Communist Revolution in 1917, and as a man with little education, found a career. Between the wars, Zhukov became a cavalry officer and attended Red Army schools for higher command. Zhukov studied hard and advanced in rank. He was also among the few officers who escaped execution or prison during Stalin's infamous purges of the late 1930s. Just before World War II, Zhukov demonstrated his skill at mechanized warfare for the first time. This rare film dates from June 1939. The Japanese were attempting a land grab in Mongolia. In the battle at the Khalkhin-Gol River, Zhukov surrounded them with a classic military pincer movement.
A pincer movement was Zhukov's trademark. And the idea was find the weakest spot or a weak spot in the flanks of the enemy forces and penetrate those, usually with a double envelopment.
Double envelopment is the military term for the pincer movement. Zhukov's use of it surprised the Japanese, cut them off, and destroyed them. He executed the tactic in a coordinated campaign combining air power, artillery, tanks, and infantry. defeating the Japanese on 31 August 1939, and absolutely shocking the enemy with his speed. World War II began the very next day when the Germans employed their own shock and speed in attacking Poland on 1 September 1939. They gave the new brand of warfare a name the world would never forget: Blitzkrieg. On 22 June 1941, the Nazis applied Blitzkrieg to the Soviet Union, invading with 2.1 million men in a surprise attack. The Nazis advanced 500 miles into the Soviet Union, but Germany blundered in expecting the Red Army to collapse. Instead, the Soviets fought, and Zhukov's leadership was crucial. He organized the defense of Moscow and counterattacked. With the help of the Russian winter of 1941, he stopped the Nazis, again using a pincer movement to defeat the enemy. His success earned him, at age 45, appointment to the new position of Deputy Commander-in-Chief, second in authority to Stalin himself. Zhukov was also promoted to the rank of Marshal, the Soviet equivalent to our 5-star general. The next 3 years, he won battle after battle, driving the Nazis from Soviet soil, sending them retreating toward Germany itself.
И журнал «Американский Life».
In wartime, Life magazine published an article about Zhukov. It said, "When history faces the arduous task of naming the most prominent military leader, even among names like Eisenhower, Patton, Montgomery, and others, the name of Zhukov will glow over these like a star of unrivaled radiance."
Zhukov was as good as he was, not just because he understood how to run an army. He was also tough, ruthless in looking at a goal and achieving it no matter what that goal cost.
He was a coarse, brutal, difficult man to work with who thought nothing of taking huge amounts of casualties in order to accomplish his mission. But he had a natural ability. He had the capability of looking at the battlefield and seeing the battlefield in its entirety and anticipating what the enemy was to do and knowing when the right time was to react to this.
At the end of 1944, Zhukov and the Red Army were racing across Poland, reclaiming all the territory the Nazis had taken so brutally 5 years before. But in the Kremlin, Joe Stalin seemed to be getting jealous of his star commander's success.
Zhukov became highly popular because of his victories, and he was recognized as a victor. This did not suit Stalin, who had to be the supreme boss in all circumstances.
Now, Stalin started to pull Zhukov's strings. By April 1945, the Soviet army was about to make its final push to the heart of Germany. Zhukov had everything going for him. He was the right man to conquer Berlin, the only man. That is, until Joe Stalin thought about giving the job of conqueror to somebody else. One of the things I find interesting about Berlin today is how much there is to remind us of the battle that took place here more than 60 years ago. This building is part of Humboldt University. You can still see the pockmarks from machine gun bullets. It's a familiar sight all over the city. Take a drive down almost any street, and you'll see just the sort of thing a Russian tank driver would have seen in 1945. The shape of the city is still the same. Block after block of 5- and 6-story apartment buildings, each one a ready-made fortress. For Zhukov, it required a strategy of surrounding the city and then taking it slowly, house by house, street by street. But in March of that year, the Red Army still had territory to cover. Zhukov's men were positioned along the Oder River, which runs north and south, 40 miles east of Berlin. Masses of Soviet T-34 tanks like this one were sent to staging areas for the battle. Zhukov knew that the Nazis would fight desperately. So he planned to simply overwhelm them. The Germans had 1,159 tanks in the battle. The Red Army, 6,250. But back in Moscow, Stalin was reining in his celebrated field commander. Zhukov once oversaw as many as 3 army groups. Now, Stalin gave him only one.
Those are very effective demotion. It was quite a slap in the face. It was like saying to Ike, you're no longer the supreme commander, you are now an army group commander, like Bradley or somebody like that.
But Zhukov was a good soldier, and he followed orders. Some say he relished having just a single command with Berlin as the target. He commanded the 1st Byelorussian Front. Front is a Russian term for what we would call an army group. Here's how the battlefield shaped up. Zhukov was at the Oder River. His 1st Belarusian front had a straight-line approach to Berlin. The adjacent sector belonged to the 1st Ukrainian front. It was supposed to sweep south of Berlin, leaving the capital to Zhukov alone. But the 1st Ukrainian's commander, Marshal Ivan Konev, had different ideas and would end up making trouble for Zhukov. Konev and Zhukov were bitter rivals. They couldn't stand each other. And for a dictator like Joe Stalin, that was just fine.
Stalin saw this clash of personalities and decided to use it for his own purposes.
His own purposes were to make himself look better, which he thought would happen if his commanders were trying to take each other down. In Berlin, meanwhile, the pressure was on. British and American planes had been bombing since 1943, killing 50,000 people already. Half of the city's housing was damaged, and Adolf Hitler was hiding in an underground bunker.
Not many people know what Hitler once said about Zhukov. Bewildered, he once said to his generals, "If I had only one general like Zhukov, I would have achieved world domination by now."
Все задачи установления мирового господства.
By 1945, Hitler and his inner circle had almost completely lost touch with reality. Germany was suffering from severe manpower, fuel, and equipment shortages. But the Nazis had a plan to block the Red Army from ever getting to Berlin. The Germans' main strength was Army Group Vistula, placed between Berlin and the Soviets. In command was General Gotthard Heinrizi. He was abrasive, stubborn, and he was also short. They called him the poisonous dwarf.
He was a defensive expert. He had studied Soviet tactics. He had studied Soviet doctrine. He had the ability to get into the Soviets' decision cycle, to get into their mind, understand how they were going to attack, and take countermeasures to be able to defeat it.
One of those countermeasures was launched prior to the battle and aimed at Zhukov's buildup on the Oder. It was a secret weapon called the Mistel bomber.
The Mistel bomber was, in fact, a fighter strapped to the top of a bomber on struts. The bomber had been stripped and filled with explosives, and the pilot of the fighter plane took off using all 3 engines. He then would release the bomber, sending it on automatic pilot to hit the target, while he tried to make his escape.
Even today, you can see craters near the Oder River made by Mistel bombers that fell short of their targets. Others did hit their marks, destroying important railroad bridges. For the Germans, stopping the Soviets at the Oder was critical. On 3 April 1945, both Zhukov and his rival Konev were presenting the final version of their battle plans to Stalin. Berlin was supposed to be Zhukov's target alone. His plan involved not only a direct thrust on Berlin, but also his trademark pincer movement, sending troops both north and south to surround the city before closing in for the kill. But while Konev was set to cover the territory south of the city, he said some of his men could swing up from that direction to hit Berlin directly instead of bypassing it. He argued strenuously for his participation in the strike. Stalin saw the tension between the two men, and he used it.
And he took his eraser and he erased the boundary line between the 2 army groups. Now, to a military man, this has a very special meaning, because when you erase the boundary, that means It's free space. That means whoever gets there first wins.
The free space began where the boundary line ended, at the town of Lüben, 26 miles southwest of Berlin. The undefined battle map put pressure on both commanders. But Stalin felt himself pressured. The Western Allies were closing in, and the British were agitating for a grab at Berlin. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower rejected the idea, but Stalin didn't believe it. Time was critical, and exploiting his two rival marshals was a means to an end.
Stalin used the competition between Zhukov and Konev in order to get into the city of Berlin as fast as possible. By getting this competition between his two senior subordinates, he knew they would push their own subordinates to try and beat each other into the city.
Stalin made his orders clear. Berlin had to be taken by the 1st of May, so its capture could be celebrated on May Day, the Communist workers' holiday. The attack would begin in 13 days on 16 April. Zhukov and Konev hastily assembled their resources and cranked up the intensive planning for the attack. The Reichstag building at the center of Berlin was the ultimate objective, but before they got there, they'd have to face General Heinrizi and his men at the Oder River. Marshal Zhukov's opening barrage began on schedule in the pre-dawn hours of 16 April. At that moment, he had no way of knowing that the German defenders had practically disappeared. When Marshal Zhukov lined up his troops on the Oder River for the final drive against Berlin, his first objective was the strategic high ground known as the Seelow Heights. This is one of the most distinctive weapons used during the battle. It's a mobile rocket launcher, model BM-13. The Soviet Red Army troops gave it a nickname. They called it Katyusha, a girl's name which translates in English to Kathy. Cute. The Katyusha fired up to 16 132mm rockets per salvo. The launchers were usually mounted on trucks. This one is on a Russian truck. But you'd also often see them on Lend-Lease Studebakers shipped over from the USA. The effect of these rockets on the enemy was terrifying.
Katyusha rocket launcher was a devastating weapon system. It was an area weapon designed to put tons of explosive into a large area. And when the rockets came down, they made a howling sound, therefore the name that the Germans gave to them, Stalin's organs.
1,500 Stalin organs played a hell of a tune as they opened up on the Germans. Along with 16,000 other artillery pieces, they pummeled enemy positions. They fired 1,230,000 shells and rockets. It was incredible.
That's 98,000 tons of explosives hitting the ground. That's the equivalent of 5 times the first atomic bomb that was dropped.
Here's where all that ordnance was aimed, a low-lying plain on the Oderbruch, right next to the Oder River. This is where German General Gotthard Heinrizi placed his first line of defense. But the battle was a mismatch. The Germans were outnumbered 6-1 in tanks and artillery, and nearly 4-1 in troops. The German soldiers were an odd mix of regular units together with Navy, Luftwaffe, and rear guard troops. The kind of soldiers who'd never been in the infantry before and were suddenly dumped onto the front lines. But Heinrizi at least had a plan. To cover the territory between Berlin and the Oder River, he organized defense in multiple lines. The forward line was in the Oderbruch, just west of the river. A second line was on the high ground of the Seelow Heights. A third line was behind that, 3 lines in all, in a strategy called defense in depth. A day or two before the battle, Zhukov ordered probes of the German defenses. 38 Red Army battalions of 700 men each staged quick attacks to map out the enemy defenses by seeing how they responded. It's a battlefield tactic called reconnaissance in force.
Reconnaissance in force is basically sticking your neck out to find out where the enemy is. In this case, there was also the problem that the valley was covered in minefields. And so the Soviets had to advance into those minefields, just sending men forward to clear them by walking over them.
But Heinrici was keeping a close watch on the battlefield. He knew that Soviet doctrine called for reconnaissance at force just before a main battle. At the last minute, he pulled almost all of his forces back to his second defensive line on the Seelow Heights.
And so when this huge artillery barrage came in and landed on the frontline positions designed to stun and destroy the German defenses there, they basically fell, as Heinrici says, on an empty sack.
The Oderbruch was practically deserted, though Zhukov didn't know it. His million-plus shells had been dropped on almost nobody. A row of giant searchlights figured into Zhukov's next move. It was his own idea. Zhukov planned to blind the enemy and light up the battlefield for his own troops with 143 powerful searchlights. But there was fog and smoke on the battlefield. It was a disaster.
It was like putting your high beams on in a heavy fog. They could not see anything. It was reflected back. The troops all lost their night vision capability. They were blinded, and they felt they were being silhouetted for the German gunners by these searchlights behind them.
Confusion on the battlefield slowed the Soviet advance, and when the sun rose, the infantry and tanks of Zhukov's leading divisions found the Oderbruch was practically impassable.
The Soviet tanks were unable to proceed freely because the Germans had swamped the area by releasing waters from a dam, so that the ground was exceedingly boggy.
Water was carefully released into the network of drainage canals that crisscrossed the Oderbruch. It inundated the entire plain, making it impossible for the Soviet tanks to cross. Russian tanks like this T-34-85 were not at all sophisticated, but they were sturdy, reliable, and most of all, plentiful. Now, successful main battle tanks have three common characteristics: excellent firepower, solid armor, and high mobility. The T-34 answered the mail in all of these respects. But there were limits even to the rugged T-34's mobility. The vehicle weighs 27 tons, and through its power plant and transmission, which you can see here, develops a very respectable 18 horsepower per ton of weight. The weight of the vehicle is distributed over the track system. Each one of these tracks on either side of the vehicle has 72 separate track blocks, and each block is 19 inches wide. That gives the T-34 a relatively low ground pressure. The ground clearance is 16 inches. Even in muddy terrain, those are good numbers. But the terrain that Zhukov's tank crews encountered at the Oderbruch was so wet, so boggy, that the T-34s tended to throw tracks or bottom out. And that meant that Zhukov's tank crews were restricted to hard surface roads. And there weren't many of those. The same roads had to carry everything else: the trucks, the artillery, and the soldiers on foot.
On April 16th, we launched an attack, and it was a success. We moved about 4 miles forward. Not bad. The hills of the Seelow Heights were 8 miles from the forward edge.
Vasily Ustygov was lucky. If his unit was doing well, too many others were not. Zhukov, watching the action from his command post, was not happy. With his armies confined to a few roads, the outnumbered Germans were holding them off.
Everything that they had, they targeted on these few roads. And so no matter how much force advantage the Soviets had, they could not mass these forces because they could only put a small amount of forces over these individual roads.
And the Germans at the Seelow Heights were blasting away with a highly effective weapon, their famous 88mm gun.
The 88mm cannon was probably the best overall weapon of World War II.
The 88 was originally developed as an anti-aircraft gun, but the Germans used it in many roles, most dangerously as a tank killer. It was 16 feet long, weighed 5 tons, and fired a 22-pound shell that could pierce 6 inches of armor at 2,500 yards. Its maximum range was 5 miles. Its strength was the ability to fire 25 shells per minute with deadly accuracy at moving targets. Its trajectory was extremely flat, so it could be shot almost like a rifle. If the German crew could see a tank, the 88 could kill it, a fact painfully clear at the Seelow Heights.
Zhukov признавался, что мы не...
Zhukov admitted that Russians underestimated this difficult hilly ground on the Seelow Heights and the intricate defense system the Nazis created.
Эти Зиеловские высоты.
The miscalculation put him behind schedule. Zhukov was on the phone to Moscow twice that first day. Stalin told him that his rival, Konev, was advancing quickly along his line of attack to the south. Konev, Stalin said, would be instructed to turn his troops toward the German capital. The pressure on Zhukov was intense. Berlin, the goal of goals in this most terrible of wars, was slipping out of his grasp. 19 April 1945. Marshal Georgy Zhukov's troops had finally overcome tenacious German defenses 40 miles east of Berlin. Zhukov expected the fight to take one day. Instead, it took 4, and at an enormous cost.
Here, in 4 days of battle, the Soviets admit to losing 33,000 killed. Yet it could have been twice that total. We cannot be sure.
The German losses were less because they were fighting from cover. But 12,500 defenders died, and General Heinrizi's skills, as good as they were, couldn't stand up to the massive Soviet onslaught. On 20 April, Soviet long-range artillery began to shell Berlin for the first time, and Zhukov's armies now sped directly toward the city.
Und da konnte man sehen, was
You could see huge masses of Russian war material moving towards Berlin. There was a continuous flow of vehicles, missiles, tanks.
zogen die in Richtung Berlin.
By the dawn of April 20th, we came up to the outskirts of Berlin. We passed by the northern suburbs, and now we attacked from west to east, embracing Berlin.
Zhukov was pushing his tanks and guns forward as fast as they could go. Not only did he have to make Stalin's deadline and take the city by May 1st, but he also had to get there before his chief rival, Marshal Ivan Konev.
His plan was simple: send his armies north and south to surround the city first and then work in toward the center. Konev was far to the south, but was primed to shoot at least one of his armies up to the capital. Zhukov's encirclement would cut Konev out of the action. It would also block Berlin from any German troops in a position to counterattack. But the German army outside Berlin was in disarray. One soldier remembers seeing others in flight.
The German troops who passed through were the ones Hitler always dreamed of. The huge army that was supposed to liberate him. They didn't even exist anymore. They were all fleeing. They were all gone. And we were prey of the Russian invaders.
20 April, the day the first Soviet shells fell on Berlin, was Adolf Hitler's 56th birthday. It was also the last time he came to the surface from his underground bunker. The Fuhrer reviewed a troop of Hitler Youth, now an integral part of the city's defenses.
The main battle for Berlin was supposed to be fought on the Seelow Heights. Therefore, the defenses of Berlin themselves had not really been prepared.
Civilians as well as soldiers rushed to erect last-minute defenses. Streetcars were placed across roadways, trenches and barricades were built. They tried anything to slow the steady Soviet advance. Berlin's defenders were a sad collection of soldiers. They were the boys of the Hitler Youth, old men of the ill-equipped militia groups called the Volkssturm, as well as service personnel not really trained for the front lines.
One thing they did have was this, the Panzerfaust. It's a portable, disposable anti-tank weapon. The Germans had about 3 million of these in Berlin. And even in the hands of those old men and boys, this could be a deadly weapon. It's a shoulder-fired, recoilless anti-tank weapon, and depending upon the model, has a range of about 50 to 200 meters. And here's what makes it so deadly. This warhead is what's known as a shaped charge. It's lined with copper, and it focuses the force of the blast to a fine point. The force is so concentrated, it turns the copper jacket into a jet of white-hot metal that burns a hole through the tank's armor. The hole may be small, but that jet of hot metal is enough to kill the crew inside and put the tank out of action. To prepare for his attack on the city itself, Zhukov had his mapmakers build an amazing 3D model of Berlin, so his ground commanders would have a sense of what they were up against. The tiny shapes of buildings and church steeples gave them a visual picture of what they would see in the unfamiliar city and helped them make sure their movements followed the planned routes of attack. Berlin was a tough target by virtue of its physical layout, just as it would be today. First of all, it's huge, 340 square miles altogether. It's crisscrossed by water obstacles and railroad lines. There are tunnels below ground, and the streets above are lined with well-built, thick-walled buildings, each one of them a fortress in itself. As many as 2.5 million civilians remained in Berlin, hiding in cellars, tunnels, anywhere they could find. Tessie Asselmeyer was 12 years old.
Of course we were scared. The propaganda of the Nazis described the Russians in horrible ways, as a wild, wild horde whose only goal was to kill us.
In fact, the Russians had a genuine bloodlust, fueled by propaganda of their own. A Soviet writer named Ilya Ehrenberg was notorious for whipping up the emotions of the Red Army soldiers.
If you have killed one German, kill another. Don't count the miles, don't count the days, count the Germans you have killed.
The Soviet hatred for the Nazis was driven by a seething desire for revenge because almost 4 years earlier, the Germans committed atrocities when they invaded Mother Russia.
They expected the Germans as a civilized occupation force, and there came, we can say, barbarians who killed and murdered and who looted.
As many as 19 million Soviet civilians may have been murdered by the Nazis, and the Red Army was eager to avenge them as they tightened their stranglehold on Berlin. By 24 April, 8 days after launching the campaign, Zhukov's armies had penetrated Berlin's city limits and were beginning to fight street by street toward the center and Stalin's target, the Reichstag. Konev, to the south, was racing toward Berlin on his own schedule, a schedule that suddenly threatened Zhukov.
On the 24th of April, some of Zhukov's troops encountered some of Konev's troops immediately south of Berlin. When the news got back to Zhukov, he was absolutely appalled. He'd expected Konev's troops to come towards Berlin, but never expected them to get that far.
In response, Stalin extended the line he had erased 3 weeks earlier. The new boundary separated each general's army group temporarily, but Stalin still kept them guessing. The line ended abruptly south of the city center. Just over a mile beyond was the Reichstag, clearly falling in neither man's sector. The battle's ultimate target was still in play, and neither Konev nor Zhukov knew who would get there first. Here's Marshal Zhukov's tips for conquerors. It's all about numbers. Have more of everything than your enemy. Stay focused on the mission, even in the face of heavy losses. Watch your back, especially if you plan to disobey a ruthless politician like Stalin. Germany's Reichstag is a beautiful old building. It houses the German parliament today, just as it did in 1894 when it was first built. During the Battle of Berlin in 1945, that was the Soviets' primary objective, with Zhukov and Konev racing to beat each other to the punch. To the Nazis, that building meant practically nothing.
In actual fact, the Reichstag had been burnt out in 1933, 12 years earlier, and was a complete wreck of a building.
The Nazi National Assembly actually met in a building across the street, but most Soviets believed these scenes took place in the Reichstag, so their symbol of victory would be nothing less than a red flag flying from its roof.
In the propaganda, that was a symbol of Nazi government, of Nazi rule, of Nazi crimes. And so it was for them very clear. We find the fascist beast in their nest.
It was 24 April. Zhukov's armies were closing in, but they were still about 10 miles from the Reichstag. The Soviets had encircled Berlin, but gaps in their lines offered the Germans some hope. General Karl Weitling and the remnants of his 56th Panzer Corps made it back to the city from fighting near the Oder, and Hitler appointed him commandant of Berlin.
Zhukov and the Soviets had so much at their disposal, there just wasn't much Weitling could do. He only had 50 or 60 tanks left. As it was in the beginning, so it was then. All about numbers. And these two weapons illustrate the point. This is the standard Soviet submachine gun of the era. It's the PPSH-41, known as the Papasha. Like all Russian weapons, it was easy to manufacture, sturdy, and reliable. It fires from either a 35 or a 71-round magazine. Fires at a rate of about 900 rounds per minute, and it can be fired both semi or full automatic. Now, here's the German counterpart. This is the MP3840, 9mm, fires from a 32-round magazine at a rate of 500 rounds per minute and fires full automatic only. Now, maybe the German weapon had a slight technological edge, but here's the real strength. The Germans manufactured 1.2 million of these. The Soviets manufactured 5 million of these.
The output of Soviet arms factories was prodigious, backed up by massive infusions of Lend-Lease equipment and supplies from the United States. These were Zhukov's tools of conquest, and he threw them at Berlin with a vengeance. After the city was encircled, dangerous house-to-house fighting began. But every building was a sheltered fortress. Germans traveled between basements, knocking through walls of loosened bricks that had been prepared for the purpose. Soviet artillery pounded one neighborhood after another, and Red Army soldiers cleared buildings with submachine guns and flamethrowers. As the troops extracted their revenge on Germany, civilians suffered murder, looting, and rape.
Yes, it is so. There were girls my age who it happened to. They had visible damage their whole lives.
Red Army soldiers had once been encouraged to commit such atrocities, but now Moscow reversed the policy. Knowing it would be setting up a post-war regime, Moscow needed to win the hearts and minds of the enemy, who are now flying white flags of surrender as the Soviets moved into each neighborhood. Murder and rape were now forbidden, but under the circumstances, impossible to stop.
Records from two prominent German hospitals show that something between 95,000 and 130,000 women had to be treated for as an aftermath of rape. And it is known that some 10,000 women committed suicide as a result of rape.
The Russians came as Tessie Asselmeyer hid in a basement with dozens of others. She was one of the lucky ones.
They said, "Woman, come. Woman, come." It was these two words that were so horrible. My mother put her arm around me for protection, and it worked. Mother with child. They walked by us.
The pace of fighting intensified. Coming from both the north and the south, Zhukov's men were closing in on the narrow strip of land called the Zitadelle in Berlin's center. It was bounded by the river Spree on the north and the Landwehr Canal on the south. Here were the Reichstag and all of the Nazi government buildings. But Marshal Konev was also pursuing the target. He and Zhukov were not communicating, and now the competition between them blew up.
On 28 April, Konev's troops launched a major attack with a view to getting into the very center of Berlin by that nightfall. By 11 o'clock that morning, they realized that they were firing red on red, for in front of them were some of Zhukov's troops.
For Konev, it was a humiliating mistake. Stalin now redrew the battle map for the last time. The new boundary put the Reichstag clearly in Zhukov's sector, and he wasted no time in ordering his troops to take it as quickly as possible.
Министерство внутренних дел. К рассвету 30-го вышли на восточную окраину.
By the dawn of April 30th, we saw a hideous, sooty, and damaged building, which appeared to be the Reichstag. A little later, we knew that it was.
Избитое здание.
In Berlin today, the Moltke Bridge still leads to the Reichstag from the north. This is exactly the same path the Soviets took to reach the battleground that was so important to them. The building itself, with its patched-over war scars, remains a somber monument to the battle for the city. Even though it was unimportant to the Nazi government, the Reichstag was still an excellent fort. Its windows were bricked up and the Germans inside defended ferociously. The Soviets slugged at it with heavy artillery, firing point-blank to blast their way inside. Every Red Army regiment headed toward it carried its own banner, hoping to be the first to place it on the roof. Like many of the Soviet films of the Berlin campaign, these Russian newsreels were staged after the fact. The story of the battle and the flags differs with almost everyone who tells it.
Вокруг этого очень много, так сказать, суждений разных есть, да, очень.
Much has been written about it, but many speculate too much. I will give you the real picture as I saw it. Our regiment's scout platoon did storm into the Reichstag. They used a stairway to climb up to the landing leading to the roof and hoisted 2 flags. All that happened in broad daylight about 2 p.m.
1400 on 30 April. It met Stalin's 1 May deadline with time to spare. Other accounts say it didn't happen until 22:50 that night, barely under the wire. Flag or no flag, the fighting wasn't over. Soviet artillery pounded away at the isolated pockets of resistance remaining in other areas of the city center. Hitler committed suicide on 30 April, and early the next morning, German officers began to negotiate a surrender. General Karl Weidlich, Berlin's commandant for only 8 days, surrendered the city on 2 May. Soviet films show him emerging from a bunker afterwards, but that's another case of film fabrication. The surrender actually took place in this building, headquarters of General Vasily Zhukov, one of Zhukov's best field commanders. A modest brass plaque marks the location today. The site of Germany's unconditional surrender is preserved in Berlin as well. Zhukov, the city's conqueror, presided over the event, which Russians regard as the official end of the war. To them, the surrender, signed 1 day earlier at Eisenhower's headquarters in France, is just a footnote to history. Marshal Zhukov, in conquering the German capital, oversaw a costly victory. The Soviets took more than 300,000 casualties in Operation Berlin. But for Zhukov and his countrymen, this was a triumph that meant everything.
Marshal Zhukov was the greatest Soviet general of World War II and can truly be said to be the general who beat Hitler. His heavy-handedness and his willingness to take huge numbers of casualties were such that he could have never been a general in a democratic army. We simply would not have allowed those sort of casualties to occur. But within the communist system and understanding his boss, he was the best that the Soviets had.
Zhukov's boss was another issue. In the Moscow victory parade, Zhukov couldn't have been more of a hero. He rode through Red Square on a beautiful white horse. Trouble is, Stalin wanted to ride that horse himself, but the day before, it threw it.
I should think Stalin, when he saw Zhukov ride that white horse instead of himself, he must have been intensely jealous. Simple as that.
You bet he was jealous. After the war, Stalin buried his best general in dead-end assignments. Zhukov remained a non-person in the Soviet Union for 20 years. But now, the USSR is gone. In Russia today, Stalin is primarily remembered as a villain. And Zhukov, well, he's a hero. That's how he's remembered, the conqueror of Berlin. I'm Captain Dale Dye. Thanks for watching.